Puckett and Sally Applegate-Dorman. Yeah. Back a few years ago, Frank Lowry built a little library for the corner here. Those of you who are familiar with the Little Library movement, it was done in tribute to a woman who had been a librarian her whole life, and after she passed away, her son built a little library out at their sidewalk in front of their home. And people come by, pick up books, drop them off. So that's kind of what we wanted to do down here at the corner. We leave Unity books in there, daily words, that sort of thing, and people pick them up as they're walking by in the neighborhood. But it didn't weather very well over the last couple of years. And I wanted to bless a special angel who decided to make it her own personal project over the last week to repaint that and redo the lettering, and that's Carol Richardson here. I really thank you, Carol. And if anyone who happens to have a set of hedge trimmers wants to trim all of those bushes along the south sidewalk, they've really been pretty overgrown, so I'll put that intention out there. I know that another little angel will show up. Good morning. A lot of you are familiar with Dr. Joyce Brothers. Of course, people who are showing their age a little bit know Dr. Joyce Brothers. She was a television psychologist, really the first television psychologist. She had a PhD in psychology from Columbia, and she decided to go on to a game show. And she was the first woman in 1955 to win at this game show. It was called the $64,000 question. You'd start out with a $1,000 question and a $2,000. So in some ways it was kind of similar to Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? And $64,000 in 1955 would be worth about $575,000 here in 2015 dollars. But the first woman in the 1950s with the mentality back then. So people wanted to know more about her, and she became kind of that default person that you turn to, the television psychologist who could come on shows and just help people understand, the psyche of people. She shared a story about how she was addressing a large group of women at a convention, and during her speech, she was pointing out some of the characteristics that differ men from women. And she said, of course, these are generalities, it doesn't apply to everybody, but she says, but there is a greater tendency for women to take things personally rather than men. And as she said that, a woman in the third row said, well, I don't. Taking things personally is our default mode because we see things personally through our five senses, or more accurately, our six senses. We filter the world through our experiences before, our awe, our awareness of things. This is how we kind of take in the world and try to make sense of it. Our minds are meaning-making machines. We try to find some meaning to things. So it can be very easy to react to other people's opinions. And the challenge here is to recognize when we're giving away our power, when we're giving away our sense of self to someone else, letting someone else define us or label us. This week we're kicking off a small group book discussion. The book is The Four Agreements by Don Miguel Ruiz. Now, we decided to go with this for over the summer because, there are four agreements. It's a small book, and you can cover each of the agreements over, say, a 4-week period. And we decided to do it this way because each small group, whether you're, whatever evening you're meeting on or daytime you're meeting on, and there are sign-up sheets out here in the fellowship hall, you can decide how quickly you want to work your way through the book, or if you all want to take a vacation one of the weeks. So we thought this one would give us some flexibility rather than, say, doing, like at the beginning of the year, we did E squared, which was 10 straight weeks, so that we could cover everything before we hit Easter. So we've got that flexibility there. So it's at your own pace book discussion groups, but like Todd had mentioned in the announcements, it's a great way to connect with people in our spiritual community, get to know them better than perhaps you'd have time to on a Sunday. Now the four agreements, what are the four agreements? Number one is be impeccable with your word. Number two is never take anything personally. Number three is don't make assumptions. And number 4 is do the best that you can. Now, my plan is to cover the first 2 of the agreements today, and then I'll cover the 3rd and the 4th next week. Now, who is Don Miguel Ruiz, and why did he come up with these 4 agreements? Well, he didn't. He is part of the Toltec tradition in Mexico. Now, the way Don talks about it is about 3,000 years ago, there was kind of a special group of people in the Mexican the Mexican community that had a certain amount of wisdom. They had learned how to live life peacefully and with joy. And they started to recognize that the general human race consciousness wasn't open to really embracing that. So it became kind of a secret society that carried the secrets forward. And there was always the agreement that when the new generation would assess the human race consciousness, they could decide whether to share it in a broader spectrum than they had before. And so in 1997, this book was published because he felt that the human race consciousness indeed was opening to things that it hadn't been open before. Now that sounds very noble, but when Carla and I were going through Unity Seminary, what we learned is that this is a tradition of many spiritual paths, that there's this secret knowledge that is finally being revealed. I mean, even in the Christian tradition, you've got the Masons, the Knight Templars, all of these various things. So it's a nice tradition, maybe true, maybe not, but I have noticed. I know that one of my favorite professors at Unity Village was Ed Rabel, and he talked about how he noticed that when you look at the teachings of Jesus, especially in the 4 Gospels, what did he actually teach rather than what people would teach about him? He said, I noticed that Jesus had the teachings of his works and of his words. His works were the way to get people's attention. He'd do miracles. And the people then would go, oh, wow. But continually through the Gospels, Jesus would say, look, I know a lot of you guys aren't getting this right now. Those weren't his exact words. But I need to pass this information along. And so Ed Rabel would say, well, so the works were for the time of Jesus. He says the words are for the people 2,000 years later, as the human race consciousness grew to the point where we could accept the concept that we don't need to be more spiritual because we're already spiritual beings having a human experience. We just need to open our mind to that and truly embrace it, the power of that. It's an awesome responsibility. So let's take number 1. Be impeccable with your word. The thing I love about these 4 agreements is they are so much in alignment with what Unity has been teaching for 125 years. Words can be used or abused. They're very powerful. In fact, the author writes, the word is not just a sound or a written symbol. The word is a force. It is the power you have to express and communicate, to think and thereby to create the events in your life. You can speak. What other animal on the planet can speak? The word is the most powerful tool that you have as a human. It is the tool of magic. But like a sword with 2 edges, your word can create the most beautiful dream, or your word can destroy everything around you. I know in Unity we have the concept of denials and affirmations. You know, a denial is where you release an old belief system or thought about something, and then with an affirmation you affirm the truth about the situation. And our throat, where the vocal cords are our power center. And we have a spiritual strength center in our body. In other words, it's kind of like having the Energizer Bunny battery within you. But then the power, the ability to discharge that is through the word. You send out a vibratory wave that can actually alter the molecules, the substance of the universe, to create what it is that you want to have. But then occasionally, like the legend of Frankenstein, you create something that wasn't such a bright idea after all. So you might want to dissolve and release that and come up with a better idea that would work to the betterment of everybody. And in the Gospel of Matthew, 5th chapter, 37th verse, Jesus says, let your speech be either yes or no. Don't equivocate. Don't get into all sorts of explanations. You don't need to make an excuse. Just, is it yes or no? And this is, a lot of parents and authority figures really need to embrace the power of their words. There were two sisters, Mary and Debbie. Now, Mary was a straight A student. Debbie, her younger sister, wasn't so much. And Mom wanting to be positive with the children, of course, Mary would come home with her report card of straight A's, and Mom would praise, how smart she is. And then Debbie, Mom would praise Debbie for her earnest efforts and for how pretty she was all of the time. Well, Mary did great through high school, went on to college, got a bachelor's degree, got a master's degree. But Debbie, more focused on being pretty and finding a man to take care of her. Well, Mary, turns out, discovered unity and eventually became a unity minister. But when she started recognizing the power of her words and she remembered the way her mom had kind of defined the two of them, she had a good heart-to-heart talk with her sister Debbie. And Debbie kind of had her V8 moment. Yeah, you're right. And so she recognized that, yeah, she did want to go to college. So, she talked with her husband, and, sure enough, she went on to college, like her sister, got a bachelor's degree and a master's degree. Then, like I said, Mary found a wonderful man to marry as well, and then she became a unity minister. But you recognize how powerful that can be. And I know in my own life, I had one teacher who really just chastised me, and I took her words to heart. And it wasn't until I was an adult, and really in the seminary, that the first 3 quarters of the seminary is really helping you dig up all of your stuff, to really recognize, because, it's like, okay, you need to be the clearest channel that you can be. You're going to have certain filters, but you need to be healthy about doing it. And it was, suddenly I started realizing, oh, wow, yeah, I let her define me. And in retrospect, you can see that, it's like, boy, I don't really get how this, what I really recognize is that this particular woman had really a problem with men, and she would really lean on very quiet, very introverted boys. And, here she was a 6th grade teacher. When you think about the social tools you have when you're, 13? Come on. Trying to make me break out of her shell. And there was another guy in our class, Gregory, had the same challenge with her. She wanted to break us out of our shell. Well, we're 13 years old, for crying out loud. We were impressionable. But I digress. The author shares a story of how a little girl who loved to sing, and she was singing one day, but Mom came home, and she had a headache, and she lay down, was trying to get some rest, and the little girl was singing, and the mom finally cried out, please, please don't sing, honey. It makes Mommy's head hurt. And it cast a spell on her daughter. She did not sing again until well into adulthood, realizing that she made that sense, that agreement that, oh my goodness, my singing makes people's heads hurt. And so she didn't do it until she got to the point of recognizing that her mom just was having a lousy day. There's a long tradition of being a person of your word. Being able to just make an agreement on a handshake. And of course that was because, even in the times of Jesus, your word meant a lot. And that's why the firstborn son was considered a representative of the family. And he could indeed, once he passed the age of, I can't remember what it was back in those days, he could make deals or make oral contracts just as much as his father could. But in Atlanta, there was an elderly gentleman who stopped by the bank. He was having some financial challenges and was talking with the banker, off at the desk on the side. And when he realized the situation, it was kind of like, yeah, boy, I'm going to need to do something here. And he looked up, and he's looking at a man in line, one of the cashiers. And he says to the banker, would you mind going over there? You see that gentleman there with the glasses? Would you ask him to give me $100,000? And the banker's like, what? He goes, yeah, that guy right over there. He says, no, sir, I wouldn't feel comfortable doing that. What makes you think that he'd give you $100,000? And he says, you're right, I should go ask him myself. And he walked over, and the banker is watching this, from a distance, and the man, sees him and, gives him a big hug, and they're talking together, and sure enough, he goes to the cashier and transfers $100,000 over to this guy. And so the man comes back, and the banker's looking at him. Would you explain to me what just happened? He said, well, back about 35 years ago, I lent that man money. And he said to me at the time he wanted to pay me back, and I said, no, don't worry about it, I don't need it, but if I ever do need it, I'll be sure to ask. And he is a man of his word. Impeccable. What does the word impeccable mean? Well, it means without blemish or without sin. And of course, in unity, we talk about how the word sin, has taken on that connotation from the Christian teachings in the mainstream Christianity of it being this blemish, this demerit on your personal holy record, where it ends up the word sin is actually derivative out of the archery terms of the Old English. And a sin was when, you'd shoot at the target to try to hit the bullseye. A sin meant that not only did you not hit the bullseye, you didn't hit the target at all. And the connotation was, well, boy, you messed up on this one, but hey, try again. No big deal. So with being impeccable with your word means being willing to follow through on your word. In fact, the author says, anything that you do that goes against yourself is a sin. And by self, I interpret that to mean your true self. In your heart, when you have to do something, or when you need to refrain from doing something. The world is our mirror. So when we project blame or condemnation, it's probably because we've had that same experience. I remember earlier in my life was very angry at this one supervisor I had, and it was right about the time I was discovering unity. And then it struck me, as I was sort of learning these sort of spiritual principles, so the reason he was ticking me off is he was so much like I always had been. I could relate because I used to have those same flaws, those same character traits that he was expressing. So it's important that we express only the thoughts that we want to experience. Lee Giampolsky, in his book Smile for No Good Reason, includes a chapter entitled Watch Your Language. And he talks about the power of words like we've been talking about. He says some words are limiting and we should use them very sparingly. Words like can't, impossible, never, stupid, weak, inferior. And then he mentions a couple other labeling words like hopeless and useless. And he would teach his students about the effect of the words by having them sit together and maybe repeat a group of words and see how they felt. Words like these two groups I just did. Another group that he had was hate, impossible, afraid, frown, separate. So he'd have people just kind of do that for 5 minutes and afterwards ask them how they felt. What was your state of mind? And as you can imagine, you talk about just going down, your aura shrinks. But he says, but then you have them sit together and repeat word groups like forgive, possible, love, smile, oneness. He says, and then suddenly, they'd notice that shift. So your words not only affect the world around you, they affect you. You think of the songs about smiling and everybody smiles with you. So whatever energy we put out is going to come back to us multiplied. Okay, let's move on to the second of the 4 agreements, and that's never take anything personally. The unity movement, here in the United States, we've got about 800, unity spiritual centers. But there are only 40 congregations that have that share something in common, and that is they have a husband and a wife who are co-ministers, and they're both ordained ministers. Carla and I know this one couple named John and Lauren, and they were serving a small congregation, and it was growing, but they had a small building. In fact, I've been in that building. It really was nothing more than a sanctuary about the size of our fellowship hall. And then there was a minister's office, and then kind of a little area with a little like kitchenette, you know. And so they're outgrowing that, so they bought some land and were planning a new building. And it's one day that Lauren, John was using the office, and Lauren came to the church to do some spiritual counseling for two different people that had arranged spiritual counseling with her for that day. And it just seemed like people kept coming in and interrupting, even though they're often like the corner, of the sanctuary. And then she went off into the other area in the kitchenette to do some work on the countertop, but then some people came in, they were needed to prepare a meal for a special event later. And she was feeling like, oh man, when am I going to get my own office, or at least my own desk? Well, that evening, they were having a committee of volunteers from the congregation who were kind of planning out the new building with some architects. And so she was listening very quietly. And so the one guy who was talking said, well, our first priorities should be a sanctuary, restrooms, and a minister's office. And she said, at that point, my mind just kind of latched a hold of that. A minister's office? Don't these people appreciate me? Don't they know? And she gets off on this long tear, just kind of seething, but she was wise enough to just kind of keep things quiet. And finally the man said, well, and obviously those are the things that we have here in this building, and we certainly don't want to lose them when we move to the new building. But what should be our second tier of priorities? He goes, well, we need a second minister's office for Lauren. We need a fellowship hall. We need a volunteer workroom. And he was going through some other things. And Lauren just had to shake her head and say, oh, wow, I took things personally. And imagine if she had jumped in at that moment that he first said, a minister's office. What do you mean, a minister's office? You know how that would have come across. Ruiz calls that mental state the middle of hell. And I had mentioned Ed Rabel before, and his definition of hell was useless, unnecessary suffering. We all go through unpleasant experiences, but when we wallow in useless, unnecessary suffering, because we're not wise enough to just move through, though I walk through the valley of death, I fear no evil. I do not stop and set up camp and wallow in pity. In a seminar on wills and trusts, a facilitator put across the question, why is it that most people leave money to their children instead of their siblings, their brothers, their sisters? And as he talked to the people in the room, people began to get it. They had developed an attitude towards their brothers or their sisters. One guy said, yeah, I was the little kid, and when my older brothers would get done playing with me or get upset with me, they would take me in a closet and hang me up on one of the hooks. And so he was pointing out, yeah, you start, those old wounds are still within us. It's like, wow, why am I feeling this way towards my siblings? But, so they leave the money to their children instead. So each of us has an opportunity to choose our life's experience. And the beautiful thing about the way most of us spend the first, say, 30 years of our life, is we spend those first 30 years of our life trying things out and finding out what doesn't work for us and who we are not. And then we have the opportunity to choose again. One of the greatest teachers of these philosophies was Jesus Christ. Jesus didn't take things personally. He was rejected when he went to his hometown. Oh, isn't that snot-nosed little carpenter's kid coming in here trying to tell us how to live our lives? Gospel of Matthew, 10th chapter, 14th verse, Jesus taught, and if anyone will not receive you or listen to your words, shake the dust from your feet and leave that house or town immediately. Now you notice he didn't say, stay there and give them a piece of your mind. Tell them why they aren't doing things correctly and why they should honor you. Don't you know how important I think I am? People would have grievances. Jesus, Matthew, 5th chapter, 40th verse. And if anyone would sue you and take your coat, give him your cloak as well. And of course, back in those days, people would wear kind of a tunic cloak, and then they'd wear an overcoat. So in other words, down to your skivvies, rather than get into an argument with people. It's like, and So, and of course, Peter denied him 3 times. Did he take it personally? No, he predicted it. Judas turned him in for treason. And if you have never seen the movie, the Last Temptation of Christ, from I think it was 1988, it was done by Martin Scorsese. Just a very powerful. It's a novel about the relationship between Judas and Jesus, and what was Jesus' greatest temptation in the world. It's worth a rental. The Last Temptation of Christ. And Jesus Christ, of course, healed people that other people would avoid. Nobody would dare touch a leper back then. They knew there was some sort of contagion, but they didn't know why. So Jesus didn't take things personally, even in his overall ministry. Gospel of Mark, 10th chapter, 17th verse. As he was setting out on his journey, a man ran up and knelt before him and asked him, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus turned to him and said, "Why do you call me good? No one is good but God alone." He wouldn't, in other words, he was humble, I guess is a good way of putting it. Now, there is one critic that we all listen to the most, and that is ourselves. And it's usually not just one critic in that mind, is it? There's a committee. You've had parents or authority figures that have implanted these little voices in your mind that drive you in certain directions or react when something happens. And being able to accept that discipline of thank you for sharing, but I'm not going to live my life that way anymore. And frankly, some of those voices are necessary, like when, say, you're walking down the street texting and not realizing you're about to walk out in front of traffic. There is that little voice, hey, wake up, snap out of it. So we have those survival responses that are necessary, but there needs to be a balance, and our team needs to work together in there. So being willing to just let go of some of those old beliefs that we had about ourselves. And the author mentions that, just being able to recognize the agreements that we made as children, those assumptions we made along the way, which of course will be the next of the 4 agreements. Young adults being willing to cancel them and replace them, and just kind of be willing to put it out there as maybe homework for the week. God, reveal to my conscious mind maybe old ways of thinking that really aren't working for me anymore, and that I want to recognize so that I can dissolve and release them. So the 4 agreements, as I mentioned, we covered the first 2 this week. We'll cover the last 2 next week. First one is be impeccable with your word. Understand the power of your spoken word. And number 2, never take anything personally. You see, what we need to truly embrace is that we think people are doing things personally to us, and we would be really disappointed to realize that people don't think about us very much. They're doing their own thing, looking out for their own best interest, and it is only when someone does open with compassion and really focuses on you that you find, yeah, indeed they are thinking of you. Our closing story is a 2-minute video from Chip Reed of the CBS Evening News about a woman who is impeccable with her word.
84-year-old Sigrid Mills loves to bake so much. She does it almost every day.
Yeah, I think that's good.
Her reward, though, is not in the eating, it's in the giving.
May I leave you something that I made homemade, all right? Cheesecake. I'm going to give you a piece.
Okay.
30 years ago, Mills started visiting patients from her church at this hospital in Dover, Delaware. She had no idea then
And it's homemade, I
it would
promise.
lead to this.
So,
How many days a week do you go to the hospital?
every day,
Every day.
every day.
In fact, she hasn't
See if
missed
I
a
can do
day
that.
in more than 10 years.
Why do you go every single day?
Because I have a big mouth. When I go and visit people, I say, I'll see you tomorrow. And once I promise something like that, I keep my promise. Would you have anybody here who would like a visit?
Many of those she visits are complete strangers.
I say to them, you don't know me and I don't know you, but we're going to get to know each other. Yes, you're teaching me.
She breaks the ice and warms the room with her favorite hymns.
In your time.
I love you, dear. I love you too.
See you tomorrow.
And she often bumps into thankful people like Shirley Mayhew, a recovering cancer patient Mills used to visit.
She makes a difference, I'll tell you. She's Serenity with a capital S.
At the supermarket recently, a former patient recognized her.
And she said, you visited me in the hospital, you brought me an apple. That was 15 years ago. I mean, my goodness.
What do you get out of this?
You know, I think the happiest I am when I can make somebody else happy. So take care of yourself, okay?
Okay. You too.
Yeah. So I'll see you tomorrow.
That's a promise that has never been broken. Chip Reed, CBS News, Dover, Delaware.
From the Gospel of Matthew, 5th chapter, 36th verse. And do not swear an oath on the head of your children or even on your own head. Let what you say be simply yes or no. Anything more than this is a deception. And may you always be open to God's guidance and grace. Now it's time for our offerings, our tithes. First, I wanted to thank someone I don't thank often enough, and that is our ushers. I know Ron Jones helps coordinate a group of volunteers, our ushers, and I know he could always use one or two more. And as you think about unity, recognize that we provide a philosophy that's spiritual, not religious, love-based, not fear-based. We honor all paths to God and have for more than 100 years now. If you use the donation tab on the unityofindy.com website, hold the amount that you're giving in your mind. And for those of you who are going to be giving cash or checks, go ahead and hold it in your hand. And recognize here again that whatever thoughts we put out come back multiplied. And I think God just struck the Morris with lightning. Okay. Hold what it is you're holding. And recognize, are you thinking thoughts of abundance in your financial life or thoughts of lack? Are you holding thoughts of love or thoughts of fear? Open your heart and pour love into it. Make it a love offering. And then let's say the affirmation on the screen together. Divine love through me blesses and multiplies all that I am, all that I give, all that I receive, and I am grateful.